Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
You don't actually go out campaign on the streets. You just turn up on the night, don't you? And you let your branding do all the work, or do you go and knock on doors?
Go knocking on doors. I'm not that loony. We sit in Wetherspoons all day long and meet everybody.
Hello and welcome to Chopper's Politics. I'm Christopher Hope, Chopper to my pals, the chief political correspondent at the Daily Telegraph. You can't have missed the tinsel twinkling in our town centres and the sprouts sneaking onto supermarket shelves. Yep, Christmas is coming. You're just a short 6 weeks from being able to put your feet up with a good book by a roaring fire. So this week, I'm giving you some suggestions of some fantastic books to read or even to give to the politics fanatic in your life. After all, with all this talk of supply issues, it's never too early to get your orders in, is it? My first guest has interviewed 12 Prime Ministers, an extraordinary feat. He's known for stripping the gloss off even the most polished politicians. And it's been said in British politics that you're nobody until you've been cockerelled. I'm talking, of course, about the legendary documentary maker Michael Cockerell and his book, Unmasking Our Leaders, which is filled with stories and anecdotes from someone with a ringside seat to power. Michael Cockerell, welcome to Chopper's Politics. Welcome to the Red Lion Pub.
Thank you so much.
What a book this is, Unmasking Our Leaders. I so enjoyed it. It talks about all the interviews you've done over the years with various prime ministers and other politicians too, but how do you go about choosing your victims?
Well, I like to call them not victims, but subjects. I'm an artist. My aim is to capture a true likeness of them. But how do I go about choosing them? In a way, they have to be at or near the top in politics. They have to have what Dennis Healey called a hinterland, not just a sort of dull politician, but something a lot more than that. Often in the case of many of the earlier politicians I've done, that was the war. You know, that gives you a hinterland, all right.
Goodness.
And they have to know where the bodies are buried and be prepared to speak with some candour about where they are. And fourthly, and probably the most important, they have to be interesting enough characters in terms of the way they talk and who they are to fill an hour of television.
And the sweep of history you've experienced, you heard Macmillan talk at the Oxford Union.
Absolutely.
About being injured on the Somme. I mean, that gives you, if I may say so, almost a complete kind of century view of history, doesn't it? You go back to
Absolutely. Going back to the Battle of the Somme, it was my first week at Oxford, and he came down as the triumphant winner of the 1959 election by a landslide. Macmillan was this extraordinary character, and he would talked about the Battle of the Somme. He was badly injured in the Battle of the Somme, and he said that at the end of the war, of his class of 20 who were reading classics at Balliol at that time, 19 of them were dead. It was just extraordinary.
You can't conceive that nowadays.
You know, there were tears, including mine, to see both the life and also that this man was a prime minister.
Is there a quality you've discerned at the heart of these prime ministers? What makes them prime minister? Because a lot of MPs say to me, particularly in the recent fluid nature of politics, I got a chance, and then I realise they're talking about themselves being prime minister, and I have to go, maybe, and don't believe it at all. I mean, is there a quality like in the Stick of Brighton Rock that they need to be prime minister?
Well, some of the other characters I've done are people who were the best prime ministers we never had, in a way, because you could never judge them. And I asked Roy Jenkins about that, who was famously Labour Home Secretary, Labour Chancellor, and founder of the Social Democratic Party, and asked him why he hadn't become prime minister. He said, Michael, I really think it's because I didn't have that streak of ruthless steel that you need to become prime minister.
Yes.
There's something in that. Bismarck said you grab hold of the coattails of the rider of history as he rides past, and you hang on to those coattails. Often there's a chance like that, and you've got to grab it.
And it was your interview with Boris Johnson that got him to say, if the ball came free at the back of the scrum, I might grab it.
wasn't
Absolutely,
it?
yes,
Famously
yeah.
in 2014 or 15, I forget the actual...
2014,
Way before he was still Mayor of London, he gave that idea, and that triggered all sorts of issues for the PM at the time, David Cameron.
Yes, exactly. He was sternly not commenting on those questions, but I just asked him a sort of seemingly inoffensive question, but would you like to be Prime Minister? Not are you going to? Are you and he said, like to be Prime Minister? Well, I'd like to be a rock star. I'd like to be an impressionist painter. I'd like to be a guitarist in a band. There's many things I'd like to be. But would you like to be Prime Minister? He said, well, difficult job, hell of a difficult job, Prime Minister. But if the ball were to come loose from the back of the strum, it'd be great to have a go at. Thank you. And it's suddenly...
And you knew it.
Well, I knew it, as did Will Walden, his press officer, as we walked out. You got it. And this was after 3 months of filming.
Yes. Was he the most fun of the Prime Ministers? I mean, I forget how many you've interviewed, actually.
12 Prime Ministers I've filmed or
most
interviewed.
fun? I imagine Boris Johnson. I may be wrong.
Boris Johnson is that mixture of the most fun and the most frustrating.
Elusive.
Absolutely elusive. Partly because a lot of the time, as he starts his sentence, he doesn't know where it's going, and he sort of suddenly admires his own articulacy and takes it down the road.
That frustrates interviews. We saw, didn't we, during the party conference, Nick Robinson said, stop talking,
Prime Minister.
And I think at the time he was thinking, I can't get this guy to answer a straight question, I've got to intervene. And it doesn't sound great, I think, doing that intervention. But
yeah, it was partly because Boris does that, where he goes on talking and not answering the question.
Yes.
And you just have to stop him. But just one Boris story, which sort of shows that in a way. One of the techniques I use, as you know, is to show prime ministers or other leading politicians film of their early life. And most of them, when they were younger, because there wasn't iPlayers or DVDs or anything like that, and because politicians are busy people, they have never seen the films of their early life. And it just, they just get attracted to the screen. And I showed him a film of himself on the zip wire, that extraordinary stuff where he's stuck on the zip wire, with Union Jack in both hands and harness and everything like that. And he said, and he'd never seen it on big close-up before, and he laughed till tears ran down his face. And he said, "But what I've got to tell you, Michael, is that is much more painful than it may look." And I said, "Why is that, Boris?" He said, well, when you've been stuck up there for a long time, chafing starts to happen. I said, "Really? Where was the chafing, Boris?" He said, "Well, I don't have to go down this road. Chafing." I said, "But in your book about the London Olympics, you said there was chafing in the groin area." Well, if I said that, it must be right. I never remember what I say.
Yes.
And I always thought that chafing in the groin area might be a good title for a biography of Boris Johnson.
Yes, most grumpy, I thought, definitely is Ted Heath. I mean, he sounds miserable when you meet him.
That's right, yeah. It was very interesting because one day he came in and he said, "Do you have the usual list of boring questions?" I said, "I'm afraid so." And we did the interview, and it went a bit better than it often did with Ted. And I said, "Did you think the questions were as boring as usual?" "Oh, yes, but infinitely more irrelevant today." And another time he said, "Do you have any training for this kind of thing?" I said, no training at all. I don't do any homework. I don't read anything about you or see any other interviews, which is entirely the opposite, of course, of what I do. Yeah. And he said, "Oh, that would account for it then."
Goodness. And your book, because you've interviewed, I say, a dozen prime ministers, it shows how TV has made them adapt into actors, and how I think Wilson adopted the pipe as this kind of symbol of working classness, and also learned to tell jokes and become this avuncular figure, didn't he? I mean,
Harold Wilson, it was Gerald Kaufman, the late Gerald Kaufman, who told me this, because in 1947 he was at Oxford in the Oxford Labour Club and invited Harold Wilson, who was a young, promising junior minister, to come down and talk. And he said he was the most boring speaker I've ever seen. And then when I saw him a few years later, he taught himself a sense of humour. And Wilson was the first one to really understand the power of television.
And the power, and going back to Heath, you talk about how you mentioned an ex-girlfriend's photograph on his bedside table. I mean,
most poignant moment.
Quite.
I mean, we talked to Ted Heath about his pre-war girlfriend before he went off to fight in the war. And when he came back as a colonel, it was thought that he would marry his pre-war girlfriend, but somehow he never did. And I showed him a picture of, she was called Kay Raven, she was the doctor's daughter where he was brought up. And I said, I heard that you kept a copy, a photograph by your bedside. Yes. Did you? Yes. And everyone wondered why you didn't propose to her. She decided to marry someone else.
Yes.
There were sort of tears in his light blue eyes.
And he was quite naive. And then you found, one of your colleagues found some kind of inscription in a book which suggested he might have been gay. I mean, it doesn't matter. And at the time, of course, why is he a confirmed bachelor and all the questions. But
it was a fascinating story that one of the researchers for Ted Heath's book told me this, that there was a famous scandal in the 1950s, a guy called Colonel Ian Harvey, who was found at midnight in the bushes in cold December night with a guardsman and had to resign, and wrote a book called To Fall Like Lucifer. And this researcher told me he found that book on Heath's bookshelf, and it said to Ted from Ian, who knows what it's like. But when this researcher came to look at the bookshelf a day later, it had disappeared.
Extraordinary. And you into them all, and you found David Cameron a kind of image maker, a kind of PR guy who was always trying to second guess your questioning, I imagine.
That's right. I mean, David Cameron was one of the most interesting people to interview in some ways, because every other prime minister or leader that I interviewed became a prime minister or leader and then got themselves a spin doctor. But David Cameron was the spin doctor who became the leader and prime minister, because if you think of it, he'd worked in research for Conservative Central Office, effectively finding stuff, ammunition for leading Tories. He briefed John Major about how to answer questions at PMQs. He failed to get into Parliament, but became a media advisor to a media company and then got in. So he was a kind of media creation, but as a media advisor, and then becomes leader of the party.
What are you doing now? Are you making films at the moment?
I'm looking for the next, what you call victim and I call subject.
Or Keir Starmer, surely. I mean, he might even want it to show the real
I'm sure
Keir.
he would want it, but I don't think he fulfills all those... I think life is almost too short to do Michael Gove, because he's tricksy beyond measure when you're dealing with him as a media person. He's always very optimistic about whether he'll do the interview. Yes. Just ring my person here. And you ring the person, they say diary problems, can't do it. Yes. And then you meet him again, and he said, must have got silted up in the machine. Yes. And then it gets silted up again in the machine.
Well, we look forward to your next film. And can our listeners find these things on iPlayer? I mean, where are these films?
Many of these films now are on iPlayer. And they can also read a copy of my book called Unmasking Our Leaders, Confessions of a Political Documentary Maker. And you can get it from all good bookshops.
I can totally recommend it.
And some bad bookshops. And, of course, online.
Well, Michael Cockerell, it's an honour and a pleasure to chat to you about your book here in the Red Lion Pub. Thanks for joining us, and we'll put a link in the show notes to how you can buy Unmasking Our Leaders from Bite Back in this show notes for this episode. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Right, please do stay with us. Coming up, we'll go from the prime ministers we've had to the people who never quite nabbed the top job. Right after this.
We're interrupting this podcast to bring you news of another Telegraph show we think you might like. It's called Planet Normal, and it's hosted by me, Liam Halligan.
And me, Alison Pearson. We're both Telegraph columnists who share the view that far too often those who shout the loudest on the telly just don't represent the views of normal people.
So take a trip with us to Planet Normal. We're joined by some stellar guests, well-known voices from politics, business and the arts.
All from different fields, but they have one thing in common. They're at the top of their game, but distinctly down to earth. The good news is I finally learnt what a podcast is and even how you subscribe to it. It's actually quite simple. Search for Planet Normal on your podcast app or click on the link in the show notes for this episode.
You don't really know what a podcast is, do you?
I am one. Look, I am one. Who needs to know what it is? I am one, okay? Shut up.
Next on our Christmas book club reading list, and I hope you're taking notes at the back, is Steve Richards, journalist and broadcaster, whose book, The Prime Ministers We Never Had, explores those political sliding doors moments. Steve Richards, an honour to welcome you to Chopper's Politics. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much.
I'm holding in my hand a book called The Prime Ministers We Never Had, Success and Failure from Butler to Corbyn. Why write this book, Steve Richards?
Well, I did some talks for the BBC. They were unscripted, improvised talks, and the first series was on prime ministers. I then did a second series for the BBC on prime ministers we never had, and I was more haunted and intrigued by those characters than the actual prime ministers. The criteria for inclusion, it's those who are seen as likely prime ministers at some point in their career and had a feasible chance of seizing that Shakespearean crown and didn't get it. It's obviously a story of soaring and then dashed hope, but I think there are lessons in the media, the parties' preoccupations with leadership in the fact that none of these figures, big figures, Rab Butler, Roy Jenkins, Dennis Healey, Michael Heseltine, Michael Portillo, and many others, why didn't they get it? So it's like a Hercule Poirot investigation, really. And I found that more compelling in many ways than trying to make sense of the prime ministers and go beyond the caricatures of the prime ministers.
Was there a reason why you found they failed? Was it that they weren't hungry enough? To quote Boris Johnson, he didn't grab the ball at the right moment at the back of the scrum when it became free. Was there a moment at which the chance was there and then it had gone for each of these individuals?
Some of them think that. I think the key lesson, which we all have to learn really as we reflect on whether Sunak's going to seize the crown, whether it's going to be Truss, whether it's going to be whoever, is that when prime ministers get that job, they are very difficult to dislodge. Much harder than they believe. As you know, Chris, they are neurotic about rivals and what might happen to them, including the current incumbent in number 10. But they are stronger than they realise, than we as journalists realise. The one I always quote is Wilson, who was paranoid about rivals, who in 1969, just 3 years after winning a landslide, in the middle of a speech, because there was so much speculation Jenkins was about to topple him, he famously said, "You may be wondering what's been going on over the last few weeks. I'll tell you what's going on. I'm going on." And it kind of reflected the fever and dampened it a bit. But the twist is, Wilson not only went on, he went on until 1976, nearly another 7 years. He fought 3 more general elections, a referendum on Europe. So they remain in place much longer than rivals dare to realise. And only one has kind of voluntarily given it up, really, and that was Wilson. The rest, one way or another, were forced out.
Can you argue that Cameron gave it up voluntarily? I mean, some would say, certainly on the right, that he could have stayed on, but he didn't.
Yeah, he wasn't kicked out, but it wasn't a planned departure. He had no intention of departing then until he realised he had lost.
Tony Blair, would you allow?
No, I think he was
forced out.
He was forced out by the Brownites in the end. But by the way, in the end being the crucial phrase. I mean, I was writing columns about when or if Brown would take over for 4 years before he did. So again, it shows how hard it is. And there are other lessons. Nearly all chancellors are seen as likely next prime ministers, and yet most of them fail to get it.
Just two you found, didn't you, in your book, I think? Just two.
Yeah,
just
in the
two.
period covered. And a real reflection of either one of two things. Willfulness in the case of Brown, real determined willfulness. And Major had only been Chancellor for about a day before he became Prime Minister. The others, Rab Butler, Roy Jenkins, Dennis Healey, Ken Clarke, were all seen as likely next Prime Ministers, but they had to take tough decisions or take tough stances on policy. And that ruled them out, because we are a party-based system. And if you are at odds with your party, you are doomed, however leaderly you might appear. I mean, Heseltine was a leaderly figure. Healey was a leaderly figure in terms of demeanour, but they were too much at odds with their party.
Just on that very point, did you find yourself looking at these people and thinking, yes, he or she would have been a better Prime Minister than one we got? I mean, take Barbara Castle, for example. You mentioned Michael Heseltine, David Miliband, of course, the Prince over the water. Do you find yourself almost running their leadership campaigns for them as you're writing your book?
Well, the answer is, in each of those cases, it's impossible to tell what they would be like. So I don't really speculate very much about the what-ifs. I do a bit with Heseltine. I think if Heseltine had beaten John Major and become Prime Minister in November 1990 and then gone on, which I think he would have done, to win the 1992 election, I think the course of the Europe debate in the Conservative Party would have taken a very different route, because at that point, you didn't have a single Tory MP calling for Britain to leave. Heseltine was a passionate pro-European, and if he had been able to assert his authority over them, of course it's a big if, the course of history would have been different. That's the only one I really speculate on. Barbara Castle surprised me as being a more thoughtful thinker than I thought she was. And she was a formidable figure, and some of her ideas were ahead of the time. Yeah. But what should be like as Prime Minister, I've no idea. And David Miliband, I do a chapter about the two Miliband brothers, this extraordinary story of ambition coinciding.
And that surely has to be made into a film one day, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, it's ultimately a very sad story. But whether either of them would have been up for that job in number 10, we will never know.
If your criteria is politicians who could have been Prime Minister, I was surprised by Jeremy Corbyn. Now, you may want to explain that to listeners of our podcast. Why is he in the book?
He gets there because he meets the criteria. If you remember, after the 2017 election, when Labour wiped out Theresa May's overall majority, for a few months, a lot of people said, I remember Tony Blair saying, look, I think it'd be a disaster, but I now think Jeremy could win next time, And George Osborne said, Labour are going to do hugely well in London next time. I think Corbyn could well be Prime Minister. And so there was a period, do you remember the Glastonbury idolatry, his more successful visit to the nightmare of Grenfell compared to Theresa May, where people wondered whether he would be the next Prime Minister, albeit, say, in a hung parliament. So he meets the criteria as a leader of the opposition who briefly looked as if he might get it. Now, I think he would have hated it. From the beginning, it was plucking somebody out of a tennis match in a park and telling them to get onto the centre court. He wasn't ready for it in any way. But that election in 2017 made him a possible Prime Minister. And the collapse from that relative high point of 2017 to December 2019 is extraordinary, and was the explanation as why he remains as one of the nevers. But he does meet the criteria.
Are there any big players around now, I wonder, who have already potentially missed their chance to be Prime Minister? Maybe Michael Gove.
Yeah. I suspect if there's a sequel, he might make it, which is a very ambiguous honour, because it means he won't have got to the very top. I think he would only make it just, to be honest, because he fought a very poor leadership contest in both the contests he has fought so far. And, they were both in different ways beset by mishaps. And I think he has always been ambiguous about leadership, the degree he half wants it and half doesn't.
Rowing himself about this ambition on his...
all the time, and for many years. And so he might make it. I mean, I don't think he'll make it to the very top. So I'd have to decide whether he had the chance to do so and fail.
Do you think that the leaders who didn't make it into number 10 were actually happier and more fulfilled, and maybe had an even longer time in politics? If you think of David Cameron now, he's out on his ear trying to find a role somewhat unsuccessfully. I wonder whether not getting the top job means you have longer on the front line?
I think it depends on the context. The leaders of the opposition who thought they would be Prime Minister or had quite a good chance of being, Neil Kinnock in 92 was the favourite to be Prime Minister. Yes. Ed Miliband was the favourite in 2015. I know they've never got over it, and they feel a deep sense of personal rejection on an epic scale. You know, all of us lot can be rejected by a few people. They feel rejected by an electorate. And I think they are tormented by it to this very day. Others adapt much better, as you suggest. Roy Jenkins went on to write books, go back to Oxford, advised Tony Blair, and was pretty relaxed about it. I think Michael Heseltine was still tormented by it. So it really varied.
Ken Clarke appeared unbothered.
Yeah, Ken Clarke carried on enjoying life. And he probably went to Ronnie Scott's each night that he got knocked out of a Tory leadership contest.
Exactly.
So he would be untroubled by it. But he's a very interesting case of someone who, in the Major era, many thought would be the next Prime Minister, and a popular one. Yeah. And because of Europe, never had a chance.
No. And do you think there was, looking at the Prime Minister who did get there, you said earlier how they just cling on, don't they? Do you think, have you divined a length of time which is the perfect length of time to be PM, after which you go a bit mad?
Yeah.
And then towards the end, Margaret Thatcher was certainly, was seen to be a bit crazy, and certainly Tony Blair also slightly towards the end of his time. Is it 2 terms, you think?
2 terms. 2 terms. Yeah. The third term is too much. And you've been cocooned in number 10 for too long by then, under immense pressure and at the same time immense number of kicks and ego trip. It's all too much for too long. And the long-serving ones do stagger out pretty exhausted, and in some cases, Margaret Thatcher never really recovered. She left and declined. 10 years is a long, long time, longer than 2 terms of a presidency in the United States, but they shouldn't pre-announce it. Cameron made a big mistake of pre-announcing when he was planning to go. Tony Blair did the same under huge pressure from Gordon Brown, who wanted it. But when people say to me, Boris Johnson, he's broke, he wants to go back onto the after-dinner circuit, I'm sure all that's true. But I'm not making predictions. It's dangerous making predictions about such an unpredictable figure. But all I will say is the recent past, he won't just give it up. He won't just pop out and say, I've had enough of this, take a bow and go back and earn a fortune.
It's because every day they're writing the first line of their obituary, aren't they? And indeed, when they stop doing that job, all they talk about is when they're doing that job. So why give it up so easily?
Exactly. And it's so hard to get. Why just hand it over? And although many of them are miserable doing it, they can't stop. And Theresa May was devastated when she had to leave, having been through 3 years of hell. And Johnson is going through a really tough time at the moment. He won't be liking any of it. He doesn't like scrutiny. I don't think he has in his life. But that does not mean he's going to say, right, that's it, back to earning a ton of money. On the basis of the past, none of them do. And that's why Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss and others should get on with their jobs and not be too tormented about seizing the crown, or else they will make this book in a future volume.
Well, Steve Richards, the Prime Ministers we never had, success and failure from Butler to Corbyn. Thanks for joining us this week on Choppers Politics.
Thank you, Chris.
Steve Richards there. My final guest holds the incredible title of the longest serving leader of a UK political party, beating the likes of Gladstone, Attlee and Churchill. Big political figures indeed. He's the only one to have led a party in 4 different decades, 2 different centuries, and 2 different millennia. The party in question? Why, it's the Monster Raving Loony Party, of course, whose current policies include, amongst other things, that all passports should be issued in the colour of the person's voting record. So Tories blue, Labour red, Greens green. Official loonies would have their passports with leopard spots. And Lib Dems would be, well, invisible. I couldn't possibly comment. I'm talking, of course, about Alan Hope, no relation, aka Howling Laud Hope. Howling Laud Hope, the leader of the Monster Raving Loony Party, welcome to Chopper's Politics.
Hello, how are you? Get it right, the official Monster Raving Loony Party.
Forgive me, is there more than one? I didn't know that.
Yes, we are the official Loony Party, not to be confused with Labour, Conservative and Liberal.
You passed recently a record, haven't you, Howling Laud Hope? You are the longest-serving party leader ever. Is that right?
Yes, in Great Britain, yes.
You've been the official leader of the official Monster Raving Loony Party for 22 continuous years. And Labour's longest-ever leader was Clement Attlee, 20 years, 2 months.
Yeah.
Harold Wilson, 13 years. Tony Blair, 12 years. That's quite an achievement. I mean, and you're known, aren't you, for your very large Stetson that you do wear, don't you, on election days?
And the biggest rosette, of course.
It's very big. And what are the colours again of the Monster Raving Loony Party? It's yellow and black.
Yellow and black. Our party animal is the leopard. It's yellow and black. We are the party that won't change their spots. And you'll notice that whenever you see any of us, we've always got a bit of leopard skin on somewhere. I actually wear a leopard skin bow tie.
Do you? How do you raise money at the Monster Raving Loony Party? Do you actually get donations from people who want you to exist?
We've got a party membership.
How many loonies are there?
Oh, I couldn't really tell you how many there are exactly who are paying up, because, I mean, when Screaming Lord Such was alive, if you just bumped into him and spoke to him, he'd give you a membership card.
Are there more than a few hundred then?
Oh, yes. All over the world.
Yeah.
In New Zealand, Australia, Canada, India, America, all expats, mind you. They just love it. There's a little bit of Great Britain to remember.
Do other countries have a Monster Raving Loony Party obsession like this country seems to have?
We have parties in America.
Yeah.
In Tallahassee, we've got a branch. In Tampa Bay, we've got a branch.
And they stand candidates out there, do they, Howling Laud Hope?
We will do, yes. We've even got a Monster Raving Loony Party in Munster in Germany.
The Munster one. Yes, I suppose that would be right. What's the most votes that one of your candidates has ever won in any election in your past 22 years running the party?
Screaming Lord Such once got 1,100 and something up in Rotherham.
Right.
That's the highest we've got in a parliamentary election. And one of our candidates got 8,000 in the European elections.
8,000. That's quite near to getting to power, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you fought Theresa May, haven't you, I think? I've seen you on Theresa May. And who have you fought? Who are the big names in British politics?
Fought them. That's a good word, isn't it? Stood alongside them.
Stood against them. Yeah, but who have you? So David Cameron, Theresa May?
Boris Johnson, Michael Cockerell.
And when you're on stage with these household names, what do they say? Are they quite glad you exist, are they?
Yeah, I tell you what, not only them, but all the media say, it's a good job you're here. It won't be so stuffy now. They love it.
And what do they say privately to you? They must quite like the fun, don't they? I mean, it gets the gaiety of life in this country.
Well, they do. I'll tell you what happens, Chris, now and again. They will talk to you and be quite jovial.
Yeah.
Until they win. And then they don't want to be anywhere near you. I always make sure that I am, though.
You always move yourself in behind the photographs, don't you?
I'm there shaking hands. The first one to shake hand, aren't I? Always.
You're the official Monster Raving Loony Party, Howling Laud Hope. What are the other rivals to you in the world of loonydom?
Well, there is the Pirate Party, I suppose.
The Pirate Party, yep, okay.
Lord Buckethead, he had his own party called the Gremloids Party, but then he defected from them and joined us.
Did he?
Yes.
That was like a merger, like the SDP and Liberal Democrats
Yeah.
coming together. What are Lord Buggerhead's policies?
Are we talking about Buggerhead or Binface now?
I don't know. I think Buggerhead.
Well, his was the same as ours, really.
Yeah.
We want to rule the Looniverse.
Exactly.
Yes.
Have any of your policies actually made it into mainstream political dialogue? I mean, let's take Brexit, for example. Was that one of your policies once?
Well, I was all for it. I wouldn't say it was our policy. No, can't say that. But I'll tell you what we have done over the years. Passports for pets. Years ago, people said, don't be so silly, that's loony. All we were saying was, why can't you have your dog or your cat inoculated at the vet, get himself a little passport, take him abroad for 2 weeks and come back without going through 6 months quarantine? Now they're doing it.
They are doing it.
And we also wanted the abolition of the 11 plus. We didn't think that 11-year-old was the right age to take an exam, which, if you passed or if you didn't, would affect what sort of job you got for the rest of your life. And they took notice, and they changed it to the 13 plus, didn't they?
That is a very serious idea, and Jeremy Corbyn would agree with you. I know that for certain.
Jeremy Corbyn, who's he?
And what's next for the Monster Raving Loony Party? Have you had your party conference this year yet? I may have missed it, and apologies if I did.
You missed it. It was up in Louth in Lincolnshire.
Where do you hold it? In a big conference centre?
a large drinking establishment.
In a pub. Next time I'll be there. What have you resolved to do at the next? I mean, are you going to stand down soon? I mean, is there any pressure from other loonies to force you out?
No, not at all. No, not at all. It's written in our constitution that I am the leader for as long as I want to be.
That's it. That sounds quite a good constitution.
Yes. but I must admit, if I could find the right person to come along, there's a position for me higher up to become president.
Yes.
And I could get a younger person come in who's really up for it. I could talk him through it and help him along and get him going.
What are the qualities you want to see in your successor?
Somebody who's obviously got a sense of humour, somebody who can afford it. Just costs a little bit. Somebody who's got the time to do it.
Yeah.
And that's the main thing. Somebody got the time to do it, because it's all right saying, oh yes, well you sit at home and you do it all on computer. Well, yes, you do, but these by-elections come up at the top of a hat.
And how many do you fight a year?
You can normally get maybe 2.
Yeah.
Maybe 3 if you're lucky.
And you don't actually go out and campaign on the streets. You just turn up on the night, don't you? And you let your branding do all the work, or do you go and knock on doors?
Go knocking on doors. I'm not that loony. We sit in Wetherspoons all day long and meet everybody.
All human life is in Wetherspoons.
Yeah. I usually spend 10 days at every town we're doing an election at, and I'll wander around the town, make ourselves known, and win a lot of support. And let me show you this, look.
Oh, you got a book out.
The Great White Hope.
Okay. Is that,
Right up your street,
that's you, is it?
That's me.
Okay. Is that self-published or available in all good bookshops?
You can get it on Amazon, but if anybody would like a signed autograph copy, if they'd like to phone, I can send them one.
That might be Alan's mobile, but I'll let you listeners decide. Well,
It's my mobile, yes, but get right for it.
Okay. Well, I'm sure they'll be on the phone. The Great White Hope, The Life and Times of Alan Howling Laud Hope is available now from Alan.
And, just before you go, there's 27 pages in this book telling you the story about how if it wasn't for me, you would never heard of the Beatles.
Right. Now, listen, before we end this podcast, we have to find out what you're talking about. Why would the Beatles not exist without Howling Laud Hope? What happened there?
Because they played in Aldershot in 1960.
Yes.
And I was playing in a little ballroom just down the road from them. They had 11 people in. I had 300. And had their gig gone, had the 300 people there that I had down the road, they would have stayed with their manager, Sam Leach. Hence, they sacked their manager, Sam Leach. And that's how they met up with Brian Epstein and George Martin. If they'd have stayed with Sam Leach and gone back to Liverpool, you probably never heard of them again.
Goodness, Graham. Was Brian Epstein your manager at the time?
No, Bob Potter was my manager.
Ah, right, yeah. If you had Epstein, you'd have been as famous as the Beatles, wouldn't you?
More famous.
Well, Alan, I look forward to seeing you next time on the by-election trail, but thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, cousin.
Alan Hope there. Now, obviously, this podcast goes out to millions of people, so we can't have Howling Laud Hope give out his mobile phone number willy-nilly across the internet. So if you would like a signed copy of his book, please do contact us. We're at chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk or tweet us at chopperspodcast, and we'll put you in touch with Alan. Well, that's all for this week on Choppers Politics. I do hope you've enjoyed our book club special. If you did, why not leave us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts? It really helps other people find this show. Thank you to my guest this week, Steve Richards, Michael Cockerell, and of course, Howling Laud Hope. Brackets, no relation, close brackets. Thank you to my producers, Giles Gear and Louisa Wells. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. As ever, please buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Until next time, though, cheerio!